Around 2 to 2.5 months ago, I posted a preview of a time-lapse that I took while we were travelling in Tasmania during the September school holidays, of a time-lapse that I took while we were in Stanley in the northwestern parts of Tasmania. Now this time-lapse was in two parts. I took the first part of the time-lapse late in the afternoon to sunset, then we went out to dinner, and when we came back I set up the camera at about roughly the same spot but at a different focal length, and I took a nighttime time-lapse. And overall I took around 1440 photos. Now this is the time-lapse that I created in camera. I've joined the two of them together, even though when we travel with our families or we're traveling with a group, we are time limited. It doesn't mean that we can't go the extra mile, that extra effort when we come home to create something even better. With my Z6 II, it's great that I have the ability to do an in-camera time-lapse. I also saved all the NEF files, so when I got home and I had the time, which I've just had now, to create a great time-lapse using Lightroom and also LRTimelapse, which is a dedicated editing program to create time-lapses. Here is the in-camera time-lapse that I created that day. So you can see it's late afternoon, the sun's setting behind us, the Nut, that's what this hill is called, it's getting close to the Blue Owl now. There's a farm just in front of us, so you can see the cows moving around and all that. Now we're really into the Blue Owl, you can see it's getting a bit darker. This is where I stopped, and this is the nighttime part now. I'm shooting much wider now at 24 mils. There's a huge light at the front. This is what you can see from the hotel. But it's quite dark. And all up, this time-lapse lasted for just under 59 seconds. It looks quite nice, but the nighttime part is very dark. The Milky Way, by this time of the year, had set in this area. There's not real much emphasis, and shooting at 24 mils at nighttime, I really wanted quite a bit of the sky. The foreground was quite bright, and if I wanted to bring out the highlights in the sky, this foreground here would just be overexposed, so I had to balance my exposure. This video is going to be longer than normal, but I want to show you in depth how I went ahead and created these two time lapses, joined them together and did all this editing. And if you want to skip ahead, you just look on the time codes and it shows you the chapter markings of the various sections of this video if one section doesn't interest you. So the day to night part of this time-lapse was created using aperture priority mode on the Z6 II. So the settings for the day to night time-lapse were, it was taken at 34 mils, set in aperture priority mode. My shutter speed at the start was 1/25th of a second, ISO 100. The last photo, which was 686 photos for that part, was 4.5 seconds, f5.6, and the ISO was 1250. The aperture stayed the same, and this is the beauty of shooting from day to night. You've just got to think that if you're shooting much later at night like this, then you would have had to reduce your aperture. Now the nighttime time-lapse took 754 photos, and the settings for the nighttime part of the time-lapse was shot in manual mode, and they were taken at 24 mils, 3 seconds, f4, ISO 2500. So two very different types of time-lapse settings, but they worked in great. You saw that this looked very good, and the reason why I stated that I use LRT time-lapse, and I'll put a link in the description here, because you can trial this program up to 1,000 photos. If you're going to use more than 1,000 photos in your time-lapse, you have to buy the program. The reason I don't use Lightroom to create my time-lapses is that Lightroom is really dedicated, has a photo editing software. Sure, you can do time lapses, and when I started doing time lapses many years ago, I was using it. But when I found this program of LRT time-lapse, I really fell in love with this program and I use it all the time. And the reason I like using LRT time-lapse is you can average the frames. You can say, okay, well, all of a sudden you get a peak that it's getting very bright and then it just goes back to normal. You can average them out. In Lightroom, you cannot do that. You are just stuck to whatever you shot. When you set up to shoot in aperture priority mode, you have to make sure that you use auto ISO, because if you don't, then your shutter speed will drop dramatically. And I didn't want a really long exposure, because that just cuts down the amount of frames that you're using. And for a time lapse, you really want a lot of photos to create a very nice, smooth time lapse. This was the first photo at night. if I just double click on one here, it's pretty bland because the foreground is so bright. And this is a problem sometimes when you're out and about, that if you're traveling, the foreground, especially if you're near a township, it's going to be very bright. So if you're trying to shoot the night sky as well, you're going to have to move away from a bright area. When you're traveling with your family, a lot of time you don't have that luxury. If we'd been staying in the center of Stanley and I want to highlight what the township looked like that night, I would have set up the exposure for that. So the sky would be very dark, and that would be great because I would just see the township. I would see the cars come and go. I would see the people walking along the streets. We were a couple of kilometres outside of Stanley. So like, okay, well, I'm just going to set this up outside. We can chill out with my wife, enjoy our family time while the camera's taking photos outside. So I've just opened up LRT Time-Lapse. On the bottom left here, you can see it shows photos, Australia Time-Lapse, Stanley, Tasmania, Time-Lapse 1. This is the first image here that's loading. And on the top right here, it says loading directory. On the bottom right here, all in the center, you can see all the photos that were taken. This is the last photo that I took for the day tonight. This is the 686th frame, taken at f5.6. The shutter speed is 4.5 seconds. The ISO is 1250. You can see there's a mark on the side of the frame. These are called keyframes, and this is the beauty of using LRT time-lapse. You can see just below it, there is another file that has been keyframed as well. This is the start of my nighttime time-lapse. If you're shooting just a day to night, you wouldn't have two keyframes together. I've done a complete tutorial on shooting a day to night time-lapse, and I'll link it here. I just want to show you that you're not stuck to just having, oh, well, I just shot a daytime time-lapse, then I shot a nighttime time-lapse, and I've got to edit these two totally separately. No, with a bit of creativity, I was able to join these two. So I just put all the files into one directory, and where they join up, I just keyframed the last file and the first file, so I know where they join. Now, if we look at the first file for the night, you can see it's much darker. So the aperture was f4, the shutter speed was 3 seconds, and the ISO was 2500. It'll stay the same all the way through to the end. Now, if we look on the top right here, we'd see it's loading. It's just about finished loading now. And we take a look now on the left, we've got a blue line. It's just starting to move around like a wave. It's just moving along. Like I said, there's a full tutorial up there, but you have to remember that when you're shooting a time lapse, you have to think that it's going to crop to 16:9. So my advice, my hint to people who start this, who don't know too much about doing time lapses, is when you're framing your shot, put the camera in movie mode, because this will give you a 16:9 frame. That way you can say, okay, well, this is really what I want. When you framed it like that, you can go back into your photo mode and do all your settings. Now the blue line has finished. We can see a nice wave pattern, then it drops dramatically. So this is where the time lapse stopped from day and it went to night. And you can see the nighttime one is basically a straight line, apart from a very sudden spike. If you remember watching through the time lapse, all of a sudden we got bright car lights or truck lights. That's that part there. If I scroll along here, I'm one frame. You can see on the right, there's a keyframe there. And I've only put 2 keyframes, and the day to night has only got 4 keyframes. 1 at the start, 1 at the end, and 2 in the middle. The reason I put this frame in, and also the reason I like LRT time-lapse, is you're not stuck to just 16:9 at a certain focal range. I knew it was going to get dark, and because I was shooting the nighttime one too, I wanted to have a zoomed in effect. So this is why this keyframe is here, because from here I will zoom in to that mountain, and when I start at night, I will have around the same focal range. I'll zoom in, and then I will gradually zoom out to the end. So it goes from being close in to wide open. You'll see what I mean a bit later. Once I've done all this, all I do is click save. It saves it, and you can see just on the right here, it says drag to Lightroom. Now we're in Adobe Lightroom. I click on the first file here, and I go down to select all. Then I go to metadata. Now the reason we're going to metadata is because we've put in these keyframes. And I click on read metadata from files. And it's giving me a warning here saying this is going to overwrite all the settings that on these files. And I go read. Now it's just going to read all the files. And on the top right of Lightroom, right up the top here, we can see it says filters off. What I'm going to click on here is say 01 LRT5 keyframes. If I click on this, now we can see the keyframes. Remember I said there was 4 during the day and 3 at night. This is where you need your input. So remember I stated that we're going to start all the way out and we're going to zoom in, but we're not going to zoom in from the start. This is why I've got quite a few keyframes. We're going to start from this one here, and you can see they're all keyframed at 4 stars. I'm going to put a 5-star on number 3, a 5-star on number 4, a 5-star on number 5, and a 5-star on number 6. You have to do this manually. Now the reason I put 5 stars is that this is going to tell LRT Time-Lapse that these frames have been modified, the focal length has been modified. From here I go into the develop mode, I'll click on keyframe number 1, and you can see here a lot of the editing's been done. If I go into the crop, so the first 3 frames I've highlighted, and I'm going to set how I like the frames cropped, like so. Keyframe 3 has got 5 stars. This is where I'm going to start the zoom in effect. Now I go to keyframe number 4 and I zoom in. That's it. And I want the rock in the middle. This looks really nice. So now I'm at the night mode. I go to keyframe number 5 and I zoom in. And I'm going to try to get the same sort of effect as the day image. This is the day, this is the night. I'm happy with that. That looks, now this one here, if we go crop, you can see we're at the full width of the image. So between number 5, if we look at number 5 here, we can see it's cropped here. Number 6 goes all the way out. So between 5 and 6, it'll just ramp up to the full width. And then between 6 and 7, it'll stay at the full width. Now what I've forgotten to show you is the beauty of using LRT Time-Lapse with Adobe Lightroom. If we go here on the right, it's edited quite well. If I go up here to the masking tool, look at all these masks that you have here. These come, apart from where it says mask number 1, all these come from LRT Time-Lapse because it gives you the options of editing certain areas. You don't have to add too much stuff extra. See, we've got a radial filter here, we've got a radial filter here, there's mask 1 here, and I have used this one. This is, I've added here. I've masked the foreground here just to brighten it up because it was a bit too dark. This is a mask that I've used. It is just a grad filter. I've just darkened the sky a little bit. This is why I like LRT Time-Lapse. It's gotten better over time. Lightroom has also gotten better. Now all we do is we come back to the library mode, we select our 7 keyframes, we go to metadata, and we say save metadata to file. So yep, continue, there you go, it saved them. Now I can go back into LRT Time-Lapse, and here we've clicked on reload, and you can see it's rereading the metadata in these files, in these 7 keyframe files. Once it's finished rereading, we'll go to the next part, which is auto transition. And this is the part that Adobe Lightroom doesn't have. This is where it averages the files. So it's going to adjust the settings that we've done in Adobe Lightroom. The first 4 settings were for the day, the next 3 were for the night. So it's going to adjust the settings for the daytime, 1, to crop our files, and 2, to adjust the settings. So we've added masks in there. It's going to adjust all that, and it's going to average it out, which Adobe Lightroom cannot do. And this is a bit of a process. You can see it's just about finished here. We've only got a couple of seconds. That's it. So now we hit auto transition, and it'll calculate the transition. So this is where it'll add the zooming in part. If I just use the timeline here, it'll start cropping in very soon. There, you can see now it's starting to crop in. Remember, like I said, if you want to start from the beginning, you could just start from the beginning. Now it's at night, and you can just graduating to the end. If you want to start zooming in from the start, then you have the 5-star keyframe all the way at the start. All we have to do now is got one more section in here, visual previews. If we look on this blue line here, we can see that it's not very even. We want to make this smooth, but the smoother you make this curve, the better your time lapse. And this is where it averages out. It fine tunes all these keyframes. So I've just clicked on visual previews. And what this is going to do is write all the data to all these files. And this takes quite a bit of time. Now it's gone from blue to pink. Once it's finished this line, and this is visual previews, the last thing we do is we'll come back and we'll use visual deflicker. This is also something that Lightroom cannot do, because when you're taking photos, you'll always have a little bit of flicker between some frames. It'll give you a very smooth transition between each frame. Now the visual previews are done. Let's take a look at what it looks like on our time lapse. You can see now on the pink line, can you see that it's not smooth? It's got a couple of little sharp spikes here. So let's play it. This shows you that all the editing has been done all through the frames, not like the previous version. Now we'll start to zoom in. Now we're at the night, it is zooming out. The beauty of this is that it gives you a preview of what your time-lapse will look like. Now we will click on Visual Deflicker, and here the default is 10. The Visual Deflicker is that green line now. Now we don't have that very sharp drop, it just curves in. I've got a nice smooth transition. If you're watching this and you're seeing quite a bit of flickering, you can say, I want more deflicker. Now this video is a bit long. I do apologize for that. I want to show how I did this because it does look easy, but it is very time consuming. So the visual flicker has finished working. Now let's play the time lapse. Now there wasn't much deflicker to start with, but I can see that it does look much better now. Deflicker is really a problem when you're going from that day to night area, when the light changes quite quickly. Now I just import all these settings back into Adobe Lightroom, and the way I do this, it just comes up here, says render the video. Lightroom users read the metadata in Adobe Lightroom and export the video from the Lightroom library. So I can leave LRT time-lapse on if I want, or I can close it down. It doesn't matter. Now I'll make these thumbnails much smaller, and I'll come up to the keyframes here on the right and say LRT5 full sequence. Now we can see we've got all the files. I go to edit, select all, and we've selected. We go to metadata and say read metadata from files. It's just giving us a warning. You're overwriting the data that's already there. And we say yes. We only edited 7 photos. Now it's got to go through and edit, put all the editing that we've done to 1440 photos. And you can't save your time-lapse until all the editing has been done. So we go ahead and say read. Now we can see up the top here, it's saying reading XMP metadata. So finally, all the previews are done. Now we save these 1440 photos. We go back up to edit, say select all. Now we've selected all files. We go crop, shift, export. I use a PC, or you can just go up to file, say export. We click on LRT time-lapse, LRT JPEG original. I can select in 4K UHD. I'll select the output path, which I've written here has Stanley. I select folder and click export. Now it will just save all the files. Now it is saving these 1440 photos. When it is finished saving, LRT time-lapse will reopen up and ask me to save the rendered 1400 photos into a time-lapse. So all the files have been saved. Now LRT time-lapse has opened up. We can go ahead and save the video. So this is the screen that comes up when we render the video. It shows the task is to render this video, LRT-timelapse01 from Tasmania Stanley, the output file. Then we have the codec and we want MP4. Then the output size, I just choose 4K UHD. My frame rate is 24 because I shoot in PAL. The speed here is 1:1. Then we have quality, I choose very high. Color sampling, I always choose. Then the gamut here, I always choose. And video levels, legal TV. And here in processing, I don't click this because I know I've already cropped it to 16:9 in Lightroom. Then we have LRT motion blur. I normally leave this at 4. Then I just choose sharpen. And from here, I go all the way to the bottom right and just click render, and it will render this video. Now, before I show you the edited version of this time-lapse, here is the in-camera time-lapse again to show you the differences between an in-camera time-lapse and the amount of effort that I put into this time-lapse. Remember, there's no cropping, there's no editing. I'm relying on just the settings that I used in the camera. Remember, the settings are, even though I was shooting in RAW, they are the JPEG settings, so your picture profile settings is what it's reading. Now it's just going to night. Remember, there's no cropping, so it looks fairly plain. Now here's the final version. You can see how different it already looks. And as we move along, now it starts to crop in slowly. Here we're going to go to night. So we've zoomed in, now we're just slowly zooming back out. It looks so much better than the in-camera time-lapse. Much different, isn't it? So thanks for watching. I've put a link in the description of other videos that might help you on creating time lapses and all that. But if you've got any comment or questions, leave it in the comment box below. I'll answer your questions. Have a good day, enjoy your photography, and I'll see you next time.